structures so vast? Jacksonville in 1901 was a growing port city, yet the infrastructure beneath parts of the burnt district appeared built for a population far larger than anything the city had ever recorded. Recovery teams quietly admitted among themselves that the extent and sophistication didn't line up with any known development phase. And although none of them were using terms like buried civilization, they were acknowledging something just as unsettling. Someone had built extensively on this ground before. Not simple cellars, not storage rooms, an entire subterranean district. As the documentation increased, so did the silence. Reports became shorter, descriptions became vague, photographs stopped showing the widest views of the discoveries. And then the excavation zones were partially filled again in late 1901, covered where needed for new foundations, and much of what was exposed was returned to darkness. Only fragments remain, notes, a handful of photographs, and the quiet testimonies of archivists who saw the files before some of them disappeared. But even from what survives, a pattern becomes visible, structures too extensive for any documented Jacksonville development, masonry too precise for the accepted time level, perhaps some old cisterns and scattered remnants from pre-fire construction. Nothing unusual, nothing extraordinary. But within weeks, that assumption collapsed because instead of a neat sequence of building phases, the teams uncovered a stack of architectural layers that didn't behave the way infrastructure of a normal city is supposed to behave. If you're finding this investigation compelling, consider subscribing. These mysteries don't fit neatly into official history, and uncovering them requires looking where conventional narratives refuse to go. The first anomaly was orientation. Each layer, documented buildings, unknown sub-basements, and whatever lay beneath, seemed to follow the same directional grid, the same street alignments, the same urban planning logic. Different eras shouldn't do that. Different builders, different decades, different purposes. They don't build in perfect alignment with structures that came generations before. Yet beneath Jacksonville, they did. Corridors from one era connected directly to passages buried meters below them. Structural walls maintained the same bearing even when separated by what appeared to be decades of sediment. It was as if every group that ever built on this ground was following an original street plan, one that no longer existed in any city records. As the workers dug deeper, the layers became stranger. Beneath the expected foundation and clay, they began encountering brickwork that looked nothing like contemporary construction. Much larger units, much tighter mortar jointed members of the Geological Survey team. Water-damaged foundations, brick surfaces eroded as if exposed to flowing water for extended periods, lower passages with flood marks, walls with mineral deposits that only form after prolonged submersion. Yet there is no historical record of Jacksonville experiencing flooding at these depths in recent centuries. No maps showing underground streams beneath these specific locations. Nothing that explains why large sections of the deepest structures look like they had once been completely submerged or buried beneath layers of waterlogged sediment for decades, possibly longer. Recovery photographs taken in 1901 show this clearly. Workers standing beside archways so massive that the men look miniature in comparison. Brickwork laid so precisely that even today masons study the archival images in disbelief. Angles and curves that resemble engineering far more sophisticated than anything turn-of-the-century Florida is credited with. But the most unsettling detail was not what appeared in the photographs. It was what didn't appear in the archives. The official reports written in the months after the fire barely mention these features. Some drawings omit the deepest levels entirely. Certain structures are summarized with vague terms like old construction or previous development, even though the photographs show they were far more complex than that. The silence is hard to miss, because if these deeper layers truly belong to known historical periods, why weren't they described in detail? Why weren't the unusual construction methods documented thoroughly? Why were the photographs scattered across private collections instead of gathered into a single municipal report? Even some of the masonry raised red flags, edges too sharp, surfaces too smooth, drainage systems too sophisticated. Marks that look less like hand tools and more like precision cutting. Cutting that, according to the conventional timeline, didn't exist when those structures were supposedly built. What the recovery teams uncovered were structures that didn't match Spanish colonial construction, didn't match American frontier building, and didn't even match each other in any conventional sense. Instead, they formed a strange architectural vocabulary, one that seemed to come from multiple periods yet somehow remained unified, aligned, and impossibly systematic. The underground street grid. The first shock came with the scale itself. These weren't isolated cellars or scattered storage rooms. They were an organized network, a complete underground district with what appeared to be streets, intersections, and building foundations laid out in a coherent grid pattern. Some passages were wide enough for wagons, others contained what appeared to be sidewalk remnants, raised sections along the walls that suggested pedestrian walkways. The layout wasn't random, it was planned, designed, executed with the kind of urban organization that Jacksonville's surface streets wouldn't achieve until decades later. And then came the feature that still puzzles researchers today, the elaborate ventilation systems. Officially, they were later labelled as storm drains or natural air pockets, but nothing about them fits typical drainage or geological formations. These were engineered shafts, vertical passages with brick-lined walls positioned at regular intervals throughout the underground network. Some contained remnants of what appeared to be mechanical louvers or adjustable covers. Others showed signs of deliberate air circulation design, with angled channels that would have created natural updrafts. Workers from 1901 described them in private letters as breathing holes, not drains but ventilation for occupied spaces, though no official history acknowledges Jacksonville ever having a functioning underground district. Another anomaly appeared in the foundation system itself. Throughout the underground network, workers found massive support columns, brick pillars far more substantial than anything needed to support the wooden buildings that had stood above. These weren't holding up warehouses or shops. They were engineered to bear enormous distributed loads, as if the entire surface level was meant to be substantially heavier. It created an uncomfortable possibility. The Jacksonville that burned in 1901 may not have been the first city on this site. It may have been built on top of something much larger, a development whose scale was never recorded, never taught, and never explained in Florida's official history. The deeper the workers dug, the more impossible it became to dismiss. Emerged was evidence